Jamie Byng is the publisher and CEO of Canongate.
We don't use the word CEO. I'm the publisher at Canongate.
Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to start off by kissing your ass. It's such a literary story, in a way, what you did. You come from nobility and money. Mm-hmm. And you had profligate youth. At least that's what the press said.
Yeah.
But what you've done with that is you've invested in a company that was basically in receivership 10 years ago. I worked there for a couple of years before this management buyout. But it was on the verge of going bankrupt for a second time within 3 years. So. And what you've done is gone to the very root of creative imagination. You went to the Bible and you sort of repackaged the Bible.
Yeah, it was one of the most important bits of publishing we've done, and the timing of it was we launched the pocket canons, which one thinks about the way whether things are meant to be, and there was something about the fact that it was called Canongate, and then we published the pocket canons. It was one of the things that made me feel this was fated for us to reinvent the Bible or republish it in a way that hadn't been done before.
Well, it's central to the canon too.
Yeah.
I mean, what a nice play on it.
Exactly, and I always loved Canongate for that exact reason, the way you could break it down and what gates do, because they obviously take you from one place to another and from one space to another.
And you've got a lovely logo too.
Yeah, that's a new logo that we actually commissioned. We did that about 2 years ago, I think, is when a friend of mine called Tim Moore is the guy who did it. And the pocket canons were very pivotal. It was a very pivotal piece of publishing for Canongate, because it was one of the things that it was probably the thing that kind of catapulted us to a different place as a publishing house, and it was one of the things that really put us on the map internationally as a publishing house. And
perhaps you could explain what you did. You got some big name authors to sort of introduce parts of the Bible, correct?
Yeah, it was. We broke down the Bible into its component parts, i.e. the books, and it was a friend of mine called Matt Darby, who I'd been at university with, who just called me out of the blue and said, Jamie, I've got this idea, and I don't know, it's a crazy idea, but the fact that no one's done it makes me think possibly it is crazy, and what would be the barriers to doing this? And he pitched the idea to me and said, what about publishing the Bible in great pocket-sized editions and, but in its component parts, the individual books? And I said, that's a very interesting idea, but to make it work, we'd have to commission introductions from people, and that kind of...
Faye Weldon was one that I read.
She did Corinthians, and Nick Cave did the Book of Mark, and Louis de Bernier did the Book of Job, and David Grossman did Exodus, and Bono did the Book of Psalms.
Yeah, and it's just fabulous. I mean, what you're doing is you're taking the center of the canon and you're bringing it up to date. You're modernizing it in a way.
To me, it was all about offering an opportunity for a new audience of people who perhaps hadn't read the Bible to think, well, if Nick Cave is introducing the Book of Mark, there's a reason why Nick Cave is introducing it. It's because there's something in it that he thinks is worth exploring, and it has things to teach you that are worth learning.
And plus, it's not daunting too. They're easy to read, aren't they?
That was a very important part of it as well, because there are two things driving it. I suppose one is to look at the Bible above all as a work of literature, and so the fact that it was predominantly secular writers. There was actually a wonderful man called Richard Holloway who introduced the Book of Luke, who in fact I now publish, who used to be the Bishop of Edinburgh, and it was very interesting having someone who kind of was of the cloth, as it were. And there was the Dalai Lama introduced some epistles, but other than that, they were all secular writers, in most instances, writers, and with Bono and Nick Cave, musicians, but they were people who came to the Bible as a work of literature, although they were obviously aware of what it is also a book that kind of underpins various faiths. Mm-hmm.
And of course, our Canadian, with a great Canadian critic, Northrop Frye, his great book, The Great Code, is a place to go if you read the pocket canons. Northrop Frye's book, examining the Bible as a work of literature, would be a great companion piece.
Mm-hmm. The Bible was also kind of one of the things that I realized when I first took over Canongate and was starting to think about how I could realize some of my ideas that I wanted to express as a publisher. Was you have very limited resources when you're a small house, and particularly financially, and so one of the things that I realized was kind of necessary for us to start to turn Canongate into the sort of house I wanted it to be was be quite creative with particularly classic works. And so, you know, it was easier for me to buy the rights for Knut Hamsun's Hunger, this extraordinary novel. We did a great new translation with Sverre Lyngstad, than to be involved in an auction with an agent in London where you're paying over the odds for a good or very good or not so good piece of contemporary fiction. And
well, so with the Bible, you don't have to pay anything.
Well, the Bible, we didn't have to pay anyone. But prior to that, we'd been acquiring reprint rights in some really fascinating books. You know, I bought the reprint rights for Charles Mingus's Beneath the Underdog, which I absolutely love, one of the great music autobiographies, and we started reissuing the work of Chester Himes and John Fante and Richard Brautigan and Jack London, and in all these instances I would get interesting contemporary writers to introduce the books, because it was, to me, such an obvious marketing thing that, you know, if you get Roddy Doyle to introduce Charles Bukowski's Ham on Rye, if you sell the serial rights to Roddy's intro to GQ and the Daily Telegraph and the Scotsman and the Irish Times, you're immediately opening up Charles Bukowski to a new audience, and
plus you're getting such a great buzz. There's a buzz about it. If you've got these great contemporary writers that are doing these introductions, as you say, and that's appearing in these trendy magazines, it's just a great way to get buzz.
It was great. Now, when I started publishing the work of Iceberg Slim, who's a very interesting guy. He was a former pimp from Southside Chicago who wrote a phenomenal first book called Pimp, The Story of My Life. And when I was at Edinburgh University, where I studied literature, my dissertation was called A Development of the Black Oral Tradition, the Hip-Hop Lyric, and I wrote a 10,000-word dissertation on really where hip-hop lyrics had come from, both socially and culturally and linguistically and musically. And it was when I was reading around for this dissertation that I read an interview with Ice-T, and Ice-T was telling me in the interview, as I was reading it, that he took his name from when he was growing up in South Central. He came across the work of this former pimp from Chicago who moved to LA in the early 60s, who completely, Ice-T had never, or Tracy Marrow as he was then known, had never come across someone who spoke to him in the way that Iceberg Slim did. And he used to had huge tracks of Iceberg Slim's prose in his head, and he used to just rap it out to his friends. And so they used to always say, come on, give us some more of that Ice-T, because he was known as T for Tracy. And that's where his name came from. So I wrote to Ice-T when I'd acquired the reprint rights for Pimp and said, how about introducing it? He got back to me immediately. And having Ice-T and also Irvin Welsh gave me the most beautiful thing he wrote about Iceberg Slim, who for him is one of the great kind of unrecognized American writers of the 20th century. And the combination of Irvin and Ice-T really helped a whole, we sold...
So that's your genius, though. That is your genius, is to take these hip contemporary writers and then package them up with literature that you really think deserves a wider audience.
It just, I don't know about genius. I just think it's just obvious to me.
But no one else is doing it, though, right?
Well, people have been commissioning people to introduce books for a long time, and it's something that it's not rocket science, but the art to me is the appropriateness of the people to whom you go. And Thomas Pynchon wrote this wonderful introduction for us for a book by Jim Dodge called Stone Junction, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel. And it's that the satisfaction of going to someone who you sense because you've read their work and you've read the work that you're wanting to have introduced. And so often people came back and said yes because...
But they'd probably be grateful. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to write about someone I love.
The latest introduction that I've set in motion, and he said he definitely wants to do it, is Johnny Depp introducing John Fante's Wait Until Spring Bandini. He's a huge John Fante fan, Johnny Depp, and he puts him very much amongst a trio with Nathaniel West and Scott Fitzgerald as really the three writers from the early part of the 20th century who wrote about LA and Hollywood in a way that no one else has done before or since. Now I can't wait to see what Johnny writes about Fante. And
let me get back to the Bible here theme, the Bible, and then move to the myths, because you've done a really interesting series on myths, sort of following the model that we've just been speaking about. But I want to read the great Joseph Campbell, who spent his life studying myths, and this is what he writes about the Bible. What I would suggest is that by comparing a number of different parts of the world and differing traditions, one might arrive at an understanding of their force, their source and possible sense. For they are not historical. That much is clear. Now he's talking about myth, but he's also talking about the Bible. They speak, therefore, not out of events, but of themes of the imagination. And since they exhibit features that are actually universal, they must in some way represent features of our general racial imagination, permanent features of the human spirit, or as we say today, of the psyche. They are telling us, therefore, of matters fundamental to ourselves, enduring essential principles about which it will be good for us to know, about which, in fact, it will be necessary for us to know if our conscious minds are to be kept in touch with our most secret, motivating depths. In short, these holy tales and their images are messages to the conscious mind for quarters of the spirit unknown to normal daylight consciousness, and if read as referring to events in the field of space and time, whether of the future, past, or present, they will be misread and their force deflected. Some secondary thing outside, then, taking to itself the reference of the symbol, some sanctified stick, stone, or animal, person, event, city, or social group. So I think what he's talking about here is the literal reading of the Bible, and how dangerous that is.
Yep.
And what you're doing is you're getting straight to the creative imagination, the symbol, the importance of these stories and myths to everyday life.
Absolutely, and it's beautiful you reading that passage. It reminds me just what a beautiful prose stylist he was, Joseph Campbell, as well as the ideas contained within his prose are even more exciting, or as exciting. Yeah, it's something which I know you wanted me to read this thing that Pullman wrote, because it's a perfect kind of response to that in a way. And
Pullman, this is just to explain. This is a leaflet that is part of a boxed series that you did.
Yeah, it was something. Philip has been someone I've got to know over the last few years, and someone I admire enormously as a writer and as a thinker and as a human being. And he's been very supportive of the Myth series. When I first pitched the idea to him, and we'd never met before, although given a very beautiful blurb to a book on forgiveness that I published by actually the man I referred to earlier, Richard Holloway, the former Bishop of Edinburgh. And he'd given me a lovely blurb for it. We'd never met, and it was at the British Book Awards, and he, I think, was voted Author of the Year. It was when he'd written the concluding part of his Dark Materials trilogy, and I went up to him and said, there's something I would love to tell you about, which is this project I've been working on for 2 or 3 years, and this was about 4 years ago. And I said it's to do with myth, and the idea is I'm approaching writers from around the world whose work I admire and who I think might be interested in this project, and the idea is to get them to take a myth of their choice, any myth they want from any mythological culture, and retell it in any way they feel the urge. And Philip was immediately like, I've been doing that all my life. As a teacher for 20 years, every Easter term he used to do the Iliad, and every summer term he'd do the Odyssey, and for an hour on the Friday of each week, he would just, off the top of his head, start retelling the stories. He'd do it over 10 weeks. Kind of what a beautiful thing to have witnessed. I wish I'd been taught by Philip Pullman. I was taught by some really pretty interesting people too, but Philip that would have been a treat. And anyway, so he was, from the word go, he's like, I love this series. I want to do something for you for it. And I kept him appraised of the writers who were coming on board, and it's gathered momentum this over the kind of 7 years I've been working on it. And he was the first person to read the 3 myths that we launched with: Margaret Atwood's The Penelopiad, and Jeanette Winston's Wait, and Karen Armstrong's Short History of Myth. And I sent all 3 of them to him, hoping for some short blurb, of him to write something about the Myth series and the first 3 books in it. And I remember getting this email from Philip, having read them all. He'd loved the first 3 books in the series, but instead of just sending me a blurb, he said, I've written a short thing that I thought might be useful for you, which is titled A Word or Two About Myth. And I was so bowled over by it when I read it, because it really got to the absolute essence of what the project was all about, but also more fundamentally what writing is all about. And as he says here, a myth is intoxicating because it is something other than just a story. In one way, it's the very opposite of poetry. Robert Frost said that poetry is what gets lost in translation. We could say that a myth is a story that is not lost or harmed or diminished as it sheds the skin of one language and assumes that of another. Because as C.S. Lewis pointed out, a myth is a story whose power is independent of its telling. Our first experience of the story of Orpheus and Eurydice would affect us just as strongly in whatever version we came across it, because it's the shape of the events that contains the power, and not merely the language. This is a fact designed to keep writers humble. The brilliance and dash of our sentences are of little importance beside the events we try to describe. It's a reminder that most of our readers still regard our words as a window and not as a surface. They want to see through them to the great and tragic forms acting out the passionate drama of the story. The cosmic events the characters repeat in this driven and compulsive way are far more interesting than our prose style. Humble. Nevertheless, each new writer does bring something never seen before to a story that might have been told 1,000 times. It might never have been seen from quite this angle. It might never have been suffused with quite this emotional tone. The intelligence that plays over the events might never have glittered with quite this silvery wit. This is what makes the telling and retelling of myths such an endlessly refreshing struggle, such a demanding privilege, such a humbling joy. But when I first read that, I was just like, that is gorgeous.
Just the thing that stood out for me, I love the way he uses the word dash.
Yeah.
Let's just look at that. Where is that again?
It's the brilliance and dash
of our sentences
are of little importance beside the events we try to describe. It's like he sent me that version, and then he sent me a slightly tweaked version and a slightly tweaked version. So he'd almost he'd revised this short but really beautiful essay. And when I read that, I kind of, my heart leapt with joy because he had articulated so precisely what the whole Myths project was about. And actually it reminded me of something which there's an amazing Swiss-based publisher called Daniel Kiel who founded and still runs one of the great German language publishing houses called Diogenes. And I'd been sent about, I think it was maybe in 2002 that they had their 50th, or maybe 2001, they celebrated their 50th birthday, and Danny had started it whenever that was in 1951. At the end of this hour-long documentary that I was sent by a friend, Cornelia Eberle, who's an editor at Diogenes, the interviewer is asking Danny Kiel what is it that keeps you going, like for 50 years you still publish, and he's still as engaged and, driven and as passionate about the authors he publishes now as he was 50 years ago. And he said, all my life I've found that the writers I publish are much, much better at articulating the things I feel than I can myself. And he said it was Federico Fellini, who was a good friend and who I published, who said something to me once that in a way is the answer to your question. And he said, basically, I am an optimist because the great myth of the person who tells another person a story won't disappear that quickly. There will always be someone who feels the need to tell a friend one of his ideas or one of his dreams. And that was how that documentary ended. In fact, when we did this little myths notebook that I got here in front of me, that was something that to me was almost like a mantra for the entire initiative of this Myths project. And
not just the Myths project, but your whole raison d'etre, I would
to
think.
Being a publisher,
yes.
And it was someone like Daniel Kiel is one of the many publishers who have been publishing before me, to whom I owe much and from whom I've learned an enormous amount, whether it's directly or indirect.
And look what you've done with these books too. Just looking through them, I love the way you use both red ink and black ink throughout the books. It's just a thing of beauty.
That's a biblical thing as well, if you think about it, in terms of how we come to see the Bible often is through that use of red and black ink. So that was one of the tips of the hat going on there.
Yeah, sort of illuminated manuscripts in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also I think it's in the Karen Armstrong, or maybe it's the Jeanette Winterson, but where you've actually sort of got the blind embossing right on the jacket of the book.
It's of Karen's book.
It's just, you do justice to these works, and that's what's so pleasing from a book collector and a book lover's perspective.
It's lovely to hear you say it, because a lot of thought goes into it. So when it's appreciated, when you spend a lot of time working on something, it's a very gratifying thing. And there's something Karen said, which reminded when you were reading from the Joseph Campbell. She makes this lovely comment about myth at one point. She says a myth in one sense is an event that happened once, but which happens all the time.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're on a mission to find those voices that articulate these myths in the best possible way for this generation.
And for future generations, I hope. And I think people will be reading Margaret Atwood's The Penelope ad in 50 years' time, and will be enjoying and being kind of entertained, but also truly kind of illuminated into ideas on the way society works and the way people interact, and
tapping into the most important stories that are sort of in our genes.
Okay, in that sense, it was a very obvious idea, the myth series, because all the writers I love all writers full stop, whether they're conscious of it or not, are retelling myths, are dealing with these archetypal stories, whether it's the quest narrative or the way they are trying to spin stories that will help all of us try and understand just what it is that a life is, or a series of lives, and that journey one goes upon, and the things that can be learnt in the course of that journey to some sort of journey of enlightenment.
I was musing on this last night, and the question one should ask is, well, what myth am I living? But just to figure out, okay, where am I going? Wouldn't it be fascinating to find what that myth is, so I can tap into it?
I think you're living every myth. That's the thing. It's the way you read your life that's what determines which particular myth you see your life as following. But your life is constructed of every myth.
There is a certain amount of choice involved. You're suggesting.
Well, or no, possibly no choice at all. That your life is within every life. You can understand it through a whole number of different variants on different journeys, because every myth is a journey of one form or another.
That's the woman from Porlock.
What is Porlock?
Oh, first thing on Coleridge. He's screwing up our work.
I remember thinking when we were out in Frankfurt, where we did this incredible. It was a wonderful event out at Frankfurt with the three writers that we launched the series with, plus David Grossman, who has written a very, very interesting book on the myth of Samson, which is not simply it's not a retelling of a myth. Kind of what it is actually a psychological exploration of the character of Samson through one of the most brilliant close readings of text I've ever read. And it's one that posits at the end that Samson was the first suicide killer, and it's an attempt to try and unravel this enigmatic man that was Samson, who was not Samson the hero as David Grossman read the book, and in fact he couldn't have been further from that. And so he tries to understand why he ended up becoming the person he became. And that strikes to the very core of what every human being needs to do in the course of their life, which is trying to wrestle with the things that can't be understood in terms of the things that constitute your very idea of being.
The things that upset you, the things that you're afraid of.
Yeah.
I want to look at your success as a publisher in light of what's going on with the internet and with Amazon, and particularly I was mentioning I attended a session with Amazon recently, just yesterday, and they are making it so easy for people with manuscripts to basically promote them. For $29, you send them your manuscript and a bit of artwork, and you will have your book up beside all of your books, my book, or whoever has a book, up against the Da Vinci Code, and they'll look exactly the same up on Amazon. They'll look exactly the same. So a lot of these writers don't have to go genuflecting in front of a publisher to get exposure, to get marketing. And so my sense about the role of the publisher, say previously you were competing maybe against other publishers, to create a reputation as as an arbiter of or a discerner of great work. And it seems to me that because there's going to be such a flood of additional information and books via Amazon and these types of companies, what's going to set the publisher apart and make them successful is this the very thing that you're doing. And I see you working the floors at all these different book fairs, looking for talent, I would assume, is what your main thrust is.
I think the same imperatives exist now for a publisher as they did 200 years ago. Kind of my understanding of the relationship between the author and the publisher is not the way you've described it. I know it's not simply how you understand it either, but it's I don't expect any author to be genuflecting to me as a publisher. It's in fact the opposite. There was something that my dear friend Morgan Entrikin told me, which was something that Sam Lawrence, who was kind of his mentor and publisher, said to him, which was that never expect gratitude from an author, but be grateful when you get it, which I think was a very important thing to say, and something that I kind of believe fully.
What do you mean by that?
For me, the publisher, the opening part of the relationship is that they've created something which, depending on how you acquire books, but the way that I acquire books, or the books that I like publishing, are things that works that have a fundamental effect on me and how I see the world. So what they have done, the gift that they have given me by just even writing the work, and I don't even need to be publishing the books for that matter, it's just anything that I read that
enriches your life,
that enriches my life, is something that I am, from the word go, I owe them gratitude for having created that work. Now, in the publishing process, the publisher then has a very important role to play in understanding that work, and that understanding manifests itself in lots of different ways, from the close editing you do with the author of the book, the way you typeset it, the way you jacket it, the way you talk to booksellers about it, the way you talk to the media about the book, the way you talk to publishers around the world, and the responsibility then shifts onto the publisher in order to realize that book's potential and try and find the audience that it deserves, and really kind of spread the word about that book. And
so, but the authors don't necessarily want to get involved in all of that.
No,
they want to write.
They want to write, and they can play a key role in the way that the book can be promoted, because often they're extremely articulate and are able to open up the book in ways. But that's, as I often try and impress upon the people that I work with at Canongate, is that we actually make the books. Kind of the writers write them and do the thing without which we would be nothing. But we make them. We change the entire. We colour and alter the way that people enter their books, from the jacket we give it, from the image we create. Well,
you turn it into a work of art. You turn it into a physical object that's a work of art. But in some cases, in other cases, it's just basically packaging it to promote it so you sell lots of copies of it.
Yeah, and I think I'm absolutely passionate about the business side of publishing too, because to me they're inextricably linked. To publish successfully is not just about having a good eye and being able to pick excellent books. That's almost the easy part of it. I think the really challenging thing is to publish books in original ways and not be restricted in the way you go about your publishing by what's been done before, or not simply by what's been done before, but actually to try and do things in innovative ways in the way you take books to readers. But when an author does appreciate what you're doing, that is an enormously satisfying thing when you do publish a book successfully, and when you have that, what can be an extremely beautiful and deeply satisfying relationship. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but Jan Martel mentioned this. I read it somewhere that Faber, he was with Faber, and that he had the choice of going with you and Canongate, but he really loved the enthusiasm and thinking that you brought to wanting to work with him. I think you wrote him a significant letter, correct?
Yeah, I wrote him a letter saying why I thought Life of Pi was such a wonderful piece of fiction, and why I felt an enormous urge and desire to publish it, and why I was going to publish it as well as I possibly could, and some of the ideas that I had for how to make the book the success it deserved to be.
So did you scooping him to tick off Stephen Page, or?
I don't think Stephen wasn't even at Faber then.
Oh, wasn't he?
He joined in 2002, I think, Stephen.
Oh, okay.
And No, Faber's one of my favourite publishing houses on the planet. I think it's one of the great lists in the English language. And
they're the gold standard.
For me, they're absolutely a publishing house. One of the publishing houses I look up to and learn from, and aspire to create something that maybe in a few decades' time has something. It'll have a different sort of list, and it'll be composed of different writers. But I hope we can have the same editorial standards they have, and but we'll always be, each publishing house is distinct and has its own strengths and weaknesses, and to me the Faber has illustrated some of the things that are absolutely precious and core to a publishing house, and so I try and emulate them in lots of ways. And there was no hard feelings that Jan decided to leave. More than anything, Faber respects the author, and so
the author's choice.
Obviously. The author's choice, and look, it worked out well for all of us. Faber sell our books in Britain, so they every time.
How does that work?
We can work very closely together with key accounts, but their field reps sell our books into the stores across the UK and in Europe as well. So, our lives are closely connected.
What do you want your kids to think about you?
It's an interesting question. I don't know how much I care about what they think of me. What I want them to do is to think, and anything I can do to enable them to be free-minded and free-spirited, and to be curious and to be kind is what I care about. And the fact that they might come to recognize I was partly responsible for their outlook on life and their way of seeing is, if they come to appreciate that in later life, then that would make me very happy. I have two wonderful children who are incredibly important to me. And
how much time do you spend with them?
I have them kind of every other weekend. I'm no longer married to their mother, but we still are very close, and we live pretty close to one another in London, so I see them a lot. And
it's great. It's funny, I have the same setup, and in fact it's better than it was before. So it's interesting, maybe that's just a comment on where our familial societal patterns are going, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, my mother and father divorced when I was aged 11, and
funny, mine did too. Age 11.
It's something I'm enormously grateful for in retrospect, because they were happier as a result of it. It was extremely amicable, their divorce, and they were very philosophical about it. And I gained enormously by their separation because of particularly my stepfather, the man who married my mother. He's a very interesting man. One of the things he said to me very early on, and I had actually known him from a much younger age because he's a godfather to one of my elder sisters, and in fact he and my mother were kind of childhood sweethearts in Belfast in the late 50s, so my stepfather had always loved my mother.
Well, he helped you finance the purchase.
He was enormously supportive with the buyout of Canongate in 94, but he said something very interesting to me when he became my stepfather, and it's something which I feel I've definitely kind of digested, and it's something I've tried to do with my own children. He said, my job is to make your life interesting, not easy. And I thought that was a great way of not just describing a stepfather's role, but actually a parent's role, is to make your children's lives interesting, not easy, and to try and open things up to them, but not make sure that they find things out themselves, and that they go through that life is challenging, because it's out of challenge that challenges are what creates. Without challenges, I think much less likely to thrive as a human being, because it's out of those challenges that all sorts of interesting things come.
Yeah. You talk about emulating Faber. Mm-hmm. You've talked about seeking out great talent, and tapping into the myths that we all sort of live under and by, either consciously or not.
Yeah.
That summarizes where you're at with publishing, does it? Is there something else that's driving you, some sort of a vision, or you're happy in your married life now, so you're not seeking the white goddess?
No, I believe that anything is possible, and that one has to try and play a part in and changing things for the better. And I think books play an enormously important role, or have the potential to play an enormously important role in the kind of the psychic development of human beings. I think they're one of the...
Collectively and individually.
Exactly. And so that's where the evangelical side of me really kicks in, is in my belief and faith in the potential of the Word. And to be in a position where you can...
Well, presenting the Word too, I think that's fabulous.
Presenting the Word. You know, it is a kind of... Pullman talks about the humbling privilege of being a writer. It's a humbling privilege to be a publisher too. It's an empowering position. The decisions you make can have consequences beyond your ken at the time of action, and that's what I love, is the seeds that get sown through publishing.
There's no money. How many teams?
A whole army of you.
Yeah.
Young bus rider.
We need just about five more minutes. We're just doing an interview here. Would that be okay? Just
5 minutes.
Because there's a microphone on here. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you.
You the class always wins.
Hey. Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
That'll come over really nicely.
Yeah, it's good.
It's
lovely American accent there.
Yeah.
Where the hell were we now? We were getting really profound. There was something really good coming out of this too.
It was just, well, to me, it was getting to that kind of you ask about the drive, and I was saying that's where the evangelical thing.
The presenting of the word, and the fact that words are the most powerful thing, really.
Yeah.
You launch an idea into the collective consciousness. That's what you do. You're launching a kind of nuclear bomb, aren't you? In a way.
Yeah. Well, its lasting impact can be felt many decades and centuries after the words were written. I think an appreciation of that, both its potential for good and not so good, is something one needs to be fully aware of as a publisher, because words are very dangerous things, as well as being things that can be empowering and play a very positive role. And the Bible is a very good example of that, because of the different uses to which it's been put.
Propaganda tool.
Yeah.
Basically, for the Catholic Church to assume power over millions and millions. It's so fascinating, isn't it? You package it up, you get it out there, and then it's out there for whomever to sort of use it for whatever purposes they may wish.
Yeah. And that's where that whole thing of the ways of presenting is so important, because you can colour the way that people enter a work. But also, that's where I've always been. Ambiguity is something that I kind of love. And one of my favourite, in fact, I go back to him again, he's a very significant person in my life, is this man Richard Holloway. And one of the books we published together was a beautiful book called Doubts and Loves. And the subtitle is What is Left of Christianity. It was a book that came about because of a letter I wrote to a very interesting woman called Mary Warnock when I sent her Richard's first book we published together, which was called Godless Morality, Keeping Religion Out of Ethics. And it was a very controversial book, because he was still the Bishop of Edinburgh when he wrote it, and the underpinning thought behind the book was that religion is not the foundation of the moral. And he then extends that into a very provocative and stimulating book about where do we draw our morals from if religion is not the foundation of the moral. And it was at the end of this, Mary Warnock wrote me this lovely letter. She thought Richard's book was fantastic, but she said at the end, I wish he'd written just a small thing at the end to say, well, what is the role of religion if it's not the foundation of the moral? And he answered by writing another book called Doubts and Loves. And the title comes from a poem written by this wonderful Israeli poet called Yehuda Amichai. And the poem goes like this. It's called The Place Where We Are Right. In the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plough, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. I remember first reading that poem and rereading it and thinking about it, and I must have recited it to a few people over the years, and I'm fascinated by that central question it grapples with, which is it's a kind of railing against fundamentalism, that poem, in terms of the place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard, and flowers will never grow in that place.
And of course, who's to say what's right, what's wrong?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm always interested in, books that question, look at moral ambiguity and explore the dangers of any rigid thinking on any subject.
Well, it's also fascinating too, sir, that I met, and she's being published by Faber, Madeleine Tien. She's written a book called Certainty. She is something very special. We had a really good interview, and it centered around this need, this yearning for certainty, and incapacity of people to live with uncertainty and ambiguity. And Leonardo da Vinci, of course, that was one of his things, was teaching us how to live with ambiguity without yearning for certainty.
Well, there's that beautiful letter that Keats wrote to his brother, which is where he defined the very concept of negative capability. Do you know this letter? He said, one must have negative capability. That is, the ability to exist within mystery, uncertainty, and doubt, without ceaseless reaching after fact and reason. And it's just an absolutely beautiful kind of summation of the need to not only live, but actually to revel within negative capability. It's within negative capability that real understanding comes.
Yeah, and yet we're also afraid of the unknown, aren't we?
Yeah. I remember off the top of my head, there's a beautiful thing that Goethe wrote when he talks about action. And in a way, it's another thing that has driven me as a publisher, and I just need to... this is how it goes. He says, and to me it absolutely is a kind of mantra and something kind of deeply engraved in my heart and soul. And he said, until there is commitment, there is hesitancy, the chance to draw back, always ineffectiveness. Concerning all acts of initiative and creation, there is one elementary truth, the ignorance of which kills countless ideas and splendid plans. That the moment one commits oneself, then providence moves too. Yeah. A whole stream of events issues forth that no man could have dreamed would have come his way. If you believe you can do something, do it. Boldness has power, magic, and genius with it. Boldness is all. Do it now. And now you're thinking about what I'd like my children to think of me. One of the things I would like them to have is a fearlessness, because I think that combined with curiosity and kindness, they're very important things. And there's nothing to fear, absolutely nothing to fear. And that's been one of the things that's been very liberating for me as a publisher, is that I've had
But what are the big fears? The big fears are fear of death and fear of poverty. If you can get rid of those, then as you say, you can be bold and act, and yet so few people are capable of doing that.
Yeah, and poverty, obviously there are different ways of understanding what poverty is. You can be very wealthy and be impoverished in much more important ways than material ones. Yeah, I've never understood why one should fear anything, including death. It's crazy to fear death. In fact, I go back to Richard Holloway. The last book we published with him is this beautiful book called Looking in the Distance. Its subtitle is The Human Search for Meaning. And Richard, in the last section, it's structured as 4 movements, this book, called Seeing, Looking, can't remember the 4 sections. The last one's called Leaving, and it's a 60-page thing on death, and it is just extraordinary. You read this, and this is one of the books that... Well, it's one of the best articulations I've ever read about how one has nothing to fear in death. It's an enormously powerful piece of writing. We're going to publish it in America next year. In fact, House of Anansi published it in Canada. It's a beautiful book. I'd recommend it to anyone who listens to this interview. It's called Looking in the Distance. It's a wise book by a very wise man.
Jamie Byng, thank you for talking with us and for presenting and bringing talent and important works to